Well, I know how passing of the peace works.
During his visit to northern Michigan, noted biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann spoke at Bethany Lutheran Church in Ishpeming. Dr. Brueggemann spoke about various traditions in different Christian churches, like the tradition of passing the peace, and in this case, Brueggemann was at a Lutheran church. Passing of the peace is when people pause during their worship service and greet or shake the hands of people who are sitting in their area and say, "The peace of the Lord be always with you. Let us greet one another with a sign of peace." Or people say, "The peace of Christ be with you." However, the passing of the peace is sometimes shortened to 4 simple words, "Peace be with you." Brueggemann says the passing of the peace often comes before or after the assurance of pardon. The assurance of pardon is recited promises directly from the Scripture, on the basis of which the assurance of pardon can be given to the confessors, normally by the priest. Brueggemann says the passing of the peace is an enormously important evangelical act. The greeting is meant for anyone, but most likely designed as an outreach to people at the service whom you've never met, though, more often than not, the greeting goes to fellow church members you have known for a long time. Nevertheless, Brueggemann says, these simple greetings are important and serve an essential purpose. Here are some audio excerpts from Dr. Brueggemann's talk.
Churches that pass the peace, the Lutherans pass the peace. I think liturgically, the passing of the peace is done exactly after the assurance of pardon. Is that right? Well, it ought to be. The reason it ought to be is that when we have been forgiven, for a nanosecond, we are free enough to give ourselves over to our neighbor for a nanosecond. Now, obviously, that's not the only time in the liturgy you can do it. Well, I know how passing of the peace works. Mostly you sit with your best friends, so you pass the peace to your best friends who do not need you to pass the peace to them because you do it all the time. Or you pass the peace with people you don't know and you avoid eye contact, just kind of like that. But I incline to think that the passing of the peace is an enormously important evangelical act. It is an act of saying that we are in solidarity in the possibility of creating the fabric of a new community. And I think that's very hard to do in practice in the middle of the liturgy, but I suspect we need to work at that.
Brueggemann discussed Holy Communion, also known as the Eucharist.
The great extravaganza of generosity is the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the concrete, visible self-giving of God and God's own life as bread. Well, I belong to a church that uses little bitty pieces of bread. And I incline to think we need to give big pieces of bread. I know about the Corinthian problem of people being gluttons at the table, but that's not our problem. Our problem is it's all an act of parsimony.
Brueggemann explained the anxiety placed on the common people by the Pharoahs, who were the rulers of Egypt. He said the Pharoahs in the Old Testament were purveyors of a regime of anxiety, and that's why the disciples were happy to proclaim they would follow the 10 Commandments even before they knew what the commandments were.
But in Exodus 19, before the commandments are given, they respond and say, all of the commandments that you will pronounce to us, we will obey. They pledge to obey the commandments before they know what the commandments of God are going to be. And I think the reason they accept it that way is that they figured, I don't know what those commandments are, but they're going to be better than the commandments of Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh's commandments are always make more bricks, be more productive, serve the regime of anxiety.
Brueggemann said God's gift of enormous abundance took the power away from the Pharaoh's regime of anxiety and kingdom of scarcity. Brueggemann makes a comparison to the anxiety and scarcity in the Old Testament to the consumerism and greed of today. Brueggemann said the church's task is to provide abundance that may help overcome the deficit of anxiety in which many people live even today.
And so I imagine that what this story is about is that God's incredible capacity to give us more than we need for the day puts us in a situation where we no longer need to have nightmares about scarcity. And if you track through the Old Testament, you will find that there are these odd characters like Elijah and Elisha who regularly feed crowds of people with miraculous bread, miraculous meat, and miraculous oil. And then the text that I thought of about abundance, which you know very well, is in Isaiah 55. Everyone who thirsts, come buy wine and money without price and drink milk and water. It's all free.
Brueggemann said one of the saddest quotes by Jesus is in the New Testament book of Mark.
Because Jesus is always the teacher. He seizes what we call in seminary the critical incident to help his disciples reflect on it. So he takes the disciples, and it says they were all on a boat. Then the next sentence says, and they forgot the bread. And he says, geez, you forgot the bread. And the disciples say, he's just saying that to us because we forgot the bread. They didn't understand that Jesus is in the bread business. But then he says to them, watch out for the bread of the Herodians and the bread of the Pharisees. Watch out for the bread of Pharaoh, because if you eat the bread of Pharaoh, your stomach will be filled with anxiety. And then he gets a little reprimanding, and he says to them, do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? Do you have hearts and not understand? Don't you know what we've been doing? And the disciples are like good seminarians. They know that the strategic response is to avoid eye contact. Jesus is a good teacher. So Jesus knows if you get too far out in front of your class, you got to pull back to simpler questions. And what he's got on his hand is a bunch of concrete operational people. So you got to ask them concrete operational questions. Every pastor knows about children like that in confirmation class. What Mark is telling us is that the disciples know the numbers, but they have any idea what the numbers mean. And the paragraph ends with what I think must be one of the saddest statements by Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus says to them, do you not yet understand? He says to his disciples, you don't get it, do you? What's to get is wherever Jesus is, the power of anxiety has been broken, and there is an abundance that lets us get our minds off ourselves.
I'm Greg Peterson, and you're watching Earthkeeper TV.